for the Great Commission, to reach unbelievers and to make them disciples of Jesus Christ. Dr. Hunter is the author of 32 books. He has consulted more than 1,700 churches from 78 denominations, as well as non-denominational and independent churches. He developed the SEND movement, which trains congregational members to become missionaries to those who are unchurched in their social networks. Kent writes the bi-monthly Church Doctor Report and also has a podcast, Prescriptions from a Church Doctor, both found on www.churchdoctor.org. Kent lives on a tree farm, which sounds amazingly wonderful, in Northeast Indiana with his wife, Janet. They have 2 grown children, Laura and John. It is my pleasure to welcome to our gathering this day, Dr. Kent Hunter.
Well, thank you, Jan. It is wonderful to be with you. Love the LCMC. And I put my watch up here, which reminded me of a story I heard a long time ago. I noticed this is resting off, so we're in really good shape here today. We'll see if we make it through the first 5 minutes. So it reminded me of the story when my watch fell off here that I heard a long time ago. It was about 2 young guys who were in school. One was Catholic, one was Lutheran. And they got to talking. They said, hey, why don't we visit each other's church? And, you come with me and I'll explain what's going on and how they do stuff. And then, I'll go with you and you can. So they went to Catholic church. And, they went in and right away they went up the aisle and the little kid genuflected. And so they got in their seat and the guy said, what does that mean? He explained. And they went through the whole Catholic service that way. Then they went the next week to the Lutheran church. And so Lutheran guy said, yeah, I'll explain to you whatever's going on. And so they did that all through the service until it came time to the sermon. Pastor got up, took off his watch, and put it right there. And the Catholic kid said, what does that mean? And the Lutheran kid said, that don't mean a thing. Yeah, you pastors know. Yeah, well, we're just really glad to be here today. And it's really kind of a, well, honestly, I have a confession to make. I don't think I've ever done that before in any place that I've been, anywhere in the world. But I'm going to start with a confession. I was a pastor for a number of years in the United States and a couple of different cities and areas. And as time went on, early on I got some extra training. After I got my PhD at the theology at the seminary, I then got interested. I was trying to find something about how do you do better mission? How do you reach out to people? And as I reflected on that, I didn't get that at the Lutheran Seminary too much. And so one day I got a notice that talked about some kind of a doctor of ministry program. And I went to that and learned how to do, mission work. And so that was great, and it really helped my church, which was in the inner city of Detroit at that time, my first church. And it was really great. Our people learned to reach out and to do so cross-culturally in a multicultural community. And that was a wonderful experience. And then my missionary training, I decided, I got so busy because people kept asking me to come to speak somewhere, do this, do that. Somebody actually asked me to come and consult their church. I looked it up in the dictionary to figure out what that meant. But I actually went to that church, and that started a whole new process of ministry. And it grew and grew and grew, and ultimately became Church Doctor Ministries. I moved to a smaller church, and I decided I'm going to try what we do, this mission stuff, at a rural church. So I went from urban Detroit to rural Indiana, and a little country church, and it had been, close to closing. And they couldn't even afford a full-time pastor. I said, that's okay. I do this other stuff half-time now, so I'll be glad to help. And that church grew also. And so as we went through that, that's kind of my background. And then it just kept growing and growing, and I added staff and church doctor ministries. And so now for a long time, I've been full-time working with churches, and we've worked with hundreds of churches all over the country and on every continent but Antarctica. They don't have a church there yet, but when they get one there, Tracy's going to send me so that we can say we've been on every continent. She won't go, but she's going to send me. So anyway, all my life I've been a Missouri Synod pastor. And my confession is this. In the church that we attended, after I was no longer a pastor, we went to a church, and my wife was a preschool teacher at this Missouri Synod church, not too far away. And so it was natural. We joined that church officially, and that's where we went to church. And I was able to work with a pastor. He was actually was my roommate back in college, and he was back, and now he was at that church, and so I was able to behind the scenes without interfering with the church to kind of mentor him and encourage him in some mission stuff. We started contemporary worship service. Church started to grow like crazy. It was wonderful, and so it was a wonderful situation. Lo and behold, eventually he retired and moved away. The associate pastor, who was also mission-minded, he carried on, and so it was really great. It was a great outreach. They had a Lutheran school, so my wife could reach out. She knew enough from me about how to reach people that were unchurched who put their kids in preschool. And so anyway, it was a good situation. And the contemporary worship was the landing place for most of those people. And so it was really great. And then that pastor retired. It wasn't we burned them all out. It's just they retired. And then we got another pastor who basically it appeared that his modus operandi was, let's return this church to the 17th century. And even his gospel sounded like law. And my wife and I told my wife, I said, I know you've been working here all these years, now you're retired, but we got so many friends here, but I absolutely cannot, it's not healthy, it's not spiritually healthy for me. I can't go to a church that is not interested in reaching lost people. I just can't do it. I'm so ingrained in this that I can't stomach it. And so my confession is that for a while, we shopped churches, and we just didn't feel at home wherever we went. And then what happened was our son, who had been working in a revival situation in England, of all places, for 6 years, married a Brit, and then both of them, as a couple, went to Malaysia as missionaries and planted a church in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, which Malaysia is a Muslim country. They have a Muslim government. But they do allow Christian churches, but you can't go there on a Christian church visa or a church planting visa. So they went on a visa, and they taught at an international school, which my son had never taught school ever, but he had 4th grade, and he learned a lot at the beginning. I don't know what the kids learned, but he learned a lot. So anyway, they were there, and his wife's a teacher, so that was all right. And so they planted a church with 23 other Brits who were sent there and paid for by a Chinese guy who lived in Malaysia, a wealthy guy, paid for the trip over there for 25 people from England, one of them being an American, our son. That church, we went to visit it, my wife and I, and visit them. That church in 1 year went from 0 to 250 people, all brand new Christians in a Muslim country. That's what mission training can do to make a difference for God's work and mission. So, back to our dilemma with this pastor. Our son tried to go to a Lutheran seminary after all he had learned in England and all the missionary work he had done. He looked at Lutheran seminaries with a different eye than I did. I didn't know anything. I just thought, well, I've always been a Missouri Synod Lutheran. I have to go to a Missouri Synod Lutheran seminary and college and all the rest. But he had a whole different worldview by then. He ended up at Indiana Wesleyan University and got his Master's of Divinity there. But he had to do all of his papers from a Lutheran perspective. What a great way to do a seminary. Anyway, so he actually was into my Luther's works more than I ever was myself in graduate school. So he got all that stuff from the Lutheran perspective, and his professors were all happy about that. But he also learned more about church planting and expansion of the kingdom and all that sort of thing. And he just recently got his MDiv. Meanwhile, he had to have some kind of a church where he would do his internship, get practical experience. Well, it happened to be this church in another town down the road that had left the ELCA. There goes my watch again. I might just speak all day. I don't want to step on it. So he went to this church and did his internship. Then what happened is that church became vacant. And so they went through the process. Oh, no, they called Church Doctor Ministries to do a consultation with them. And we did this report, and they figured out a lot about their church and had some visions for the future and all these recommendations that we made. And so that was very helpful. They really liked that. And so then, and my wife and I are meanwhile trying to find a church somewhere. And lo and behold, because he did his internship there, they interviewed him, among others, to see if he might get the call to that church. Anyway, long story, it's kind of a long story anyway, but long story, not so long, he became the pastor. They called him. So my confession is, I'm no longer Missouri Synod. I belong to the LCMC. I've left the dark side. Anyway, we're excited about talking to you today. Oh yeah, you've got a booklet in your packet, and that booklet looks like this, and that booklet kind of guides you through everything except the stories that I've already told you. And so let's get into that. And I am very excited to share this because we are going to look at what happens after a pandemic. We've done a lot of research in this area. There's a lot of history that we can relate to, and it's pretty exciting. So I want to begin with the question, why was Jesus born in Israel? Well, that's a no-brainer. Everybody probably knows that already. It was the promised land promised by God. He wasn't going to show up in Afghanistan or somewhere in South America. Everybody knew that Jesus was going to be born in Israel. So when that began to happen, for people who knew the promises from the Old Testament, it was natural to get it, for at least those who knew what they could expect. But the big question that we've been wrestling with and wondering about our world right now and our churches and our opportunity is, why was Jesus born then? Because God can do anything he wants at any time he wants. So it's not a big deal, and not for God. And so of all the times in history, why was it precisely at that moment that Jesus was born? And the why is because Israel was under the siege of the Roman Empire. It was a horrible time in Israel. It wasn't a pandemic of a disease, but it was the overcoming of the promised land, and the Romans were taxing the people and sending their money to a pagan emperor in Rome who would have people come into an arena and kill each other for sport. This is an abomination for people who knew God, the God of Israel. Why would Jesus be born then? Because I believe people who are under stress are highly receptive And so there's massive receptivity when people are moved out of their comfort zones. Welcome to the world, the whole world, that we live in right now. And as the pandemic of COVID-19 begins to recede anywhere in the world, we have a tremendous opportunity. So, let's take a look at Roman number 4 on your list there. Church membership among U.S. adults. Now, this is from the Gallup organization, and they use several surveys for this, because in recent years they have developed surveys that target Jewish people and Muslim people, because there are a lot of those in America, and Gallup's trying to be politically correct. But what I have here is those people who are Christians, and the question they ask is very simple. It's right underneath the title. Do you happen to be a member of a church, synagogue, or mosque? And the different surveys are church, or it might be mosque. They did different surveys with that last word. And the percentage here is of the Christians who said, yes, I happen to be a member of a church. That doesn't mean they go to church. It doesn't mean they're active in the church. It doesn't ask what they really believe or how much of that they believe. It just is about the bare bones question you could ever ask. And the reason they start with the words, do you happen, is what I learned in my statistical training. That's the way you soften the question so you get people to answer anything. You make it as soft as possible. So that's why it says, do you happen to be a member of a church? So there you've got the line starting in 1935. Gallup started this, and every 5 years they have moved through this. And one of the things that you obviously can see as you look at the right end of the graph, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand. Ladies and gentlemen, we are losing America. We Christians are losing our own country. We are following Europe. And if you've been there and if you visit all those wonderful cathedrals, which are great to see, you don't see anybody there worshiping except maybe a handful of people in their 80s and 90s on a Sunday morning. And the rest of the people in the whole building are there as tourists taking pictures with their cameras. I know I've been in many of those cathedrals throughout Europe, on the continent and also in England and Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And so, as you look at the fall of Christianity, for the first time in history, since they've started this survey, it is below 50% of those who happen to belong to a church. And so that should get our attention. I hope it does. I don't like to be negative, but we are in a declining situation overall. Now, there are many outliers in the United States. There are great churches that are reaching people, but at the end of the day, the net total of where we are in America is headed for the toilet. However, I want to point out on this graph and talk a little bit about what we call a macro event. Because when the Romans took over Israel and Jesus was born in that context, that for those people, those Jewish people, the Romans occupying their land, the land that God promised, was a macro event. The taxes that they had to pay for their lives and all they believed about God was a macro event for them. And so, why did God pick that time? Because people are receptive during a macro event. Their life is disheveled. They are disrupted. They can't do their normal things. And they have lots of time to think about life. And so it's a macro event. If you look at the graph, I want you to look right after the troops came home from World War II. Now, I don't remember those days. I was just a baby right about that time. But if you look at that, the last macro event we've had until COVID was World War II. Some of the other little skirmishes and wars and things weren't really macro events that disrupted everybody. But World War II, so much changed, if you read the history, that was a macro event. And right after that, you have some of the highest numbers since Gallup started this research. Not only that, but if you look at not just the percentages, and it went on for a while. I can't predict how long we're going to be in this opportunity of receptivity to reach unchurched people, but it's certainly there, and it's going to continue for a while. But I just want to remind you of some of the things beyond the fact that we are losing America, but I want you to think back to after World War II. If you remember, some of you will remember some of these things, but it lasted a couple of decades or maybe even longer. And what happened is it not only lasted during that hot time, but it also triggered some things that are still fairly fresh in America. And you will recognize some of these if you are a watcher of what God is doing in America. So you think about it, started on the West Coast, early adopters, and the Jesus movement. And some of you may remember that. Some of the craziest looking people in the world were on fire for God. And people were scratching their heads, traditional Lutherans and other people from traditional churches were saying, what about these people? They're just really on fire for God. And the Jesus movement. Out of the Jesus movement came the Vineyard movement. And that whole movement, the Vineyard churches. And I remember visiting a Vineyard church. It was part of my assignment when I was in mission school to go to John Wimber's church. And it was an old shoe factory, and they had converted it into a church. Wall-to-wall people on fire for God, young people, and it was just amazing. And of course, that became a movement that literally went all over the world. And much later, several years later, when I was a pastor in Detroit, I had John Wimber at my Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. Yeah, the roof was still there after he left. It was amazing. It's what's called the flywheel effect, the momentum thing. So that's all part of that momentum. But if you think about it, it was during this period of time after World War II, after this macro event, where there was literally an explosion of contemporary Christian music. And now it's just part of life. But back then, it was just an explosion of that. And then ultimately, the technology came in. So the invention of screens and the death of hymnals, or the decline of hymnals, depending on how old you are and where you are and what church you're in. And you think about the increase of using former public facilities, like factories or whatever, and putting churches in buildings that were built for this contemporary age, not looking like something from Europe, and looking in what missionaries call indigenous to American life. And so as you think about that, that's part of that after effect, the flywheel effect. They offloaded the European old foreign architecture. And so as they went on with that, they also had the tremendous growth of independent and non-denominational churches. Churches that left the traditions that were carried on from Europe and some of the old baggage, which was not necessarily theology, but style. And so even churches that wanted to be new had old clothes in the eyes of people they were trying to reach who are far from God. And then you get into the whole movement that is an offspring of this whole macro event of churches birthing churches and the networks of churches, not denominations birthing churches, not denominations or regions of denominations hiring church planters to plant churches and to start those churches, but churches being the agents themselves of multiplying themselves, discipling people and moving on further. And of course, that the whole goes with the development of leadership in the church, and also has come now in most recent times to the seeds of what's called the exponential movement, where churches are really expected to multiply churches. And at the same time, the decline of long-term denominations of almost every kind. So as we look at number 5, Roman numeral 5 on our list, we're looking at the COVID-19 macro event. How long will it last? I don't know. It's hard to say. 5 to 10 years, I would say at least. There is the technological issue that is different now than it was in the last macro event, and that may speed up the process of learning and growing and change, which may reduce the number of years that we are in this golden time. But this is a great time of opportunity. And so, theologically, biblically, what is the foundational opportunity that we have from a theological perspective? And that perspective is hope. Hope. Because people today that have been through a pandemic recognize that they're not going to live forever. They knew that, but they put it far away from their thoughts. And they couldn't do that during the pandemic. They learned that people die. Some of them were young. They'd been to funerals with people that got COVID and shouldn't have died from anything else, but they died. Everybody knows somebody, most everybody knows somebody that they lost, somebody that died during COVID. And so there's this new sense of reality that non-Christian people are understanding. They also realize that there's nothing certain in life. Eating in restaurants went away. Children in school went away. Jobs at the site went away. Building supplies, toilet paper, nothing was certain. I can't believe those guys that would buy out all the toilet paper. I mean, how uncivil can you get? And so there's this surprise about the comfort of this wonderful nation we live in, which is brought to its knees by a bug nobody can see. And then, with that, the incredible impact of mental stress on people. And you see it in the news, every newscast. The time of unrest, gun violence, homelessness, politics, racial tensions, isolationism, that's social distancing, increased sadness, and the mental health stuff is everywhere. We take a group to England every year, no more than 20 people. We didn't go this last year, of course, but we're rescheduled for the third time coming up in the fall. We'll see. But we already got a full group almost there for that one. But these people have been waiting all through COVID to go to England. But we take them to the churches in England. And it's a great place to learn, because these are churches in also a declining religious atmosphere. The cathedrals, like I said, are empty. And yet there's a group of churches that are about 20 years ahead of us in a whole new movement and a return to biblical church and mission and outreach. And that's where my son was. That's how we first got introduced to it. And that connected with that church. But there are many other churches now that are in that movement. And, you can go to Africa and see growing churches. You can see them in South America. We've seen them all these places, even in South Korea and other places. But the culture in those other places is so different. It's hard to say, oh, yeah, I can see how that would work in America. But in England, it's enough like us that I mean, they speak sort of one form of English, and they drive on the other side of the road. But besides that, you can kind of understand how it would think, what it would look like. And that experience for people, we've noticed over how many years we've been doing that? 20? 20 years? Yeah. That experience for people is something that we can't teach. You have to almost experience it. It's so cool. Anyway, so as you see that, you recognize that, this could happen here. And I would guess that there are churches, whether they have visited England or wherever they got it, that get that from someone. But honestly, it's a movement, not a program. And in a movement, it's caught more than taught. And the 10 days we spent in England is enough to get infected. And so I think that probably other people from other directions in America, other movements in America, get that from the other people that are in that movement. But you have to think about this. It's more caught than taught. And so if you've got it, you're infected in a holy infection that you can give to other people. If you don't have it, hang around with people that get it, and that will take place. I want to talk about the power of hope in this time of insecurity, this macro event, because it is a season of tremendous opportunity, and it won't last forever. But this is a time really for harvest for churches. And I want to look at Romans 5, 1-5. Now, first of all, let's remember the letter to the Romans were Christians who were at the very heart of the city of the empire that had overtaken the Holy Land, the Roman Empire. So these were Christians in Rome. Life was not very easy. So if the people in Israel were going through a macro event, having to pay taxes to the Romans, having these soldiers everywhere, mean soldiers that invented crucifixion, about the worst way you could kill anybody, and so they were going through that in Israel, but these were Christians in Rome. So if you were Paul writing this letter and you understood the impact of a macro event and the discomfort of living in Rome, what in the world would you say to them? Well, in Romans 5, 1-5, now that we've been put right with God through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Yeah, have a little peace. Starting in verse 2, He, Jesus, brought us by faith into this experience. That's a very important word, experience. It's caught, not just a lot of theology taught, not just head knowledge. It's about the containers that knowledge is carried in, those containers, that lifestyle, that ethos. Verse 3, we boast of our troubles. That'd be enough to put any pastor in a nut house by the members. What do you mean we should boast of our troubles, Paul? What are you saying? Have you seen a newscast lately? Have you ever thought of a newscast that you just shake your head and say, we're going to boast about our troubles? What kind of a nutcase would recommend that? Well, his name is Paul. Because we know that trouble produces endurance. So here's the cycle. Here's the influence cycle, okay? It goes like this. Trouble produces endurance. Not just in Christians, but also in people that endured the pandemic. Verse 4, endurance brings God's approval. God's happy with people that make it through. And His, that's God's, approval creates hope. There you have, step by step, a movement blueprint. That'll preach, that'll teach, that will help you share with your unchurched neighbor or someone at work or school or wherever. So here's the point. Roman numeral 7. Calamity clarifies. And that's counterintuitive to most people. It's calamity that clarifies. When you're in a calamity, when you're in a pandemic, When you're in a macro event, that clarifies life and death, what's important, who's important. There's a season of openness. At the other end, comfort confuses, which seems odd to people. But in all our comfortable, wonderful America that we remember back before, and we're just beginning to see again now, although we're not there yet by a long shot, but that doesn't really hone people on spiritual realities. Actually, calamity does that. So if you want to see this window of opportunity for ministry, for outreach to unchurched people, we're there. And God's love conquers. That's what we learned from Paul. I just want to share with you briefly. In 2012, there's a study that was started by a bunch of scholars who put together this global research, and they do it every year. It's called the World Happiness Report. And I don't know why they started this or what their objective was, but they started this thing called the World Happiness Report. And so that was started in 2012. Just for your information, even before the pandemic, every year since 2012, the happiness level that they research has gone down in the United States. I don't know about the rest of the world, but that's what they discovered. And yet, despite all the miseries connected to the pandemic and what we've been through, the measure of actual happiness and life satisfaction hardly changed at all in their most recent study. They don't know why, but that's what they reported. But here's what they concluded. Suffering does not necessarily mean a reduction in happiness. Real happiness, real contentment has to do with, and this is these their words, and they're not a religious group. Real happiness has more to do with a sense of meaning and self-satisfaction. So when you put that into this mix of our macro event opportunity, these are big things. What is the meaning of life? And what really satisfies people? Is it really the new car? Is it really the new house? Is it really the next electronic gadget? What brings real satisfaction? That'll preach, and that'll be shared in a testimony. So, what about this? Why is it? I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Restoring Civility. And it's all about Jesus and how he taught, and how the Bible, and how even in American history, from the Scripture, the whole idea of civility is a word that means civilized. By the way, what's interesting is the word polite is the root word for politician. Go figure. It's in the book, Restoring Civility. Did we bring that? Oh, there's some out there. Okay. Anyway, it's just amazing when you think about it, and the history of our nation in terms of that. Anyway, here's the point: when you look at a newscast, why isn't 50% of every newscast reports about positive things? Because you know better than they do, everyday life has positive things also. There are positive things happening in every city, even during a pandemic. Why would every newscast, even if they do something positive, it's for like 30 seconds at the end? And some of them don't even do that. Why would they spend the entire newscast on negative things? Because that's not reality. How does that poison other people? And flip that now, and what does that say about the good news? According to the Bible, it's called good news about Jesus Christ. And what does that say to you about the mission that God has given to you? And what does that say to you personally about the unchurched neighbor you have or person at work who, after a pandemic, is dying to hear good news and they're not going to hear it on the newscast. Think about that. The gospel, the good news. So, if it's a movement, what's the deal? Do the people in your church need to hear more good news? Probably. The gospel. But the real point is the people of our churches need to be good news to other people. We got to change it from knowing it. It's not an academic deal that you leave at the church or you have in your heart. That's good. That's not enough. If you want to take advantage of this macro event, we need to be good news to people. I mean everybody. If you see a policeman anywhere, go up to him and say, "Thank you for your service." Because right now, nobody is saying anything nice to those people, it seems. That's not really true, but it seems, especially to them. I'll tell you what they'll tell you, because I put this in the book Civility. I said, I decided, even going through the airport, I mean, after 9/11, you know, they put us through all these hurdles to go through an airport, through security. And honestly, for a long time, I had a really bad attitude. I didn't let it show, but I thought, one more hurdle to fly somewhere, and I fly somewhere all the time. And I thought, gosh, just one other pain in the you know what. And so I just had this bad attitude. And then I started writing the civility book, and I thought, Ken, you got to be ashamed of yourself. I gave myself a little sermon about this. I said, why don't you go through them and say to every person through security, thank you for keeping us safe. So I started doing that. Now, the big deal you think might be all the people who said thank you. That means a lot. Oh, we don't hear that much. I bet I've done this hundreds of times now. To anybody I see in security. But that's not the big deal. You know what the big deal is? It totally changed my attitude about going through security. At first, like when Tracy occasionally travels with me or I travel with her somewhere on a project where we're both invited, at first she thought, what in the world happened to you? You can't wait to go through security. I actually look forward to going through security. I'm probably the only nut job in the whole airport that loves going through security. It changed me. So when you are good news, if you would be good news to other people, you will become more good news as a person. Now you're moving not in a program, but a movement. You can't beat it. So we speak the good news. God loves you. So your church has entered a window of opportunity. What are you going to do? Whatever you do will make all the difference. So, next point, the great paradigm shift for your church. Where's the mission field? Our best guess, our analysis of your greatest challenge. Someone has stated the great lie in American Christianity that the mission field is somewhere over there, far away. It's a great lie. And so in so many denominations that we've worked with, 78 different denominations, non-denominational, independent churches, we find almost everywhere the same thing. That when you talk about the mission field, everybody automatically thinks about some place in Africa or South America or someplace like that. And that's been the great American lie for so long. So that answers the question, Kent, why did you go away 4 years of college in a Lutheran college, 4 years of seminary, then 3 years of graduate school with a PhD in theology, got out, got a church in Detroit that had been dying in an African-American community with a bunch of white people in my church, and I didn't know a lick about missiology, missions. I didn't get trained in missions. If I didn't get trained in missions, I couldn't train my people in missions. We need to learn and help people in our churches learn all the beautiful things the Bible says about missiology or missions. But if pastors haven't been trained, how can they train their people? It's like the enemy somewhere made up this lie that we are a Christian nation, so if you're going to go to seminary and you want to be a missionary, good, you have to go to mission school. And then we'll send you far away, which is great. But we don't train our own people to do that. And so, the end result, we are losing America. Honestly, most pastors, as I've learned from many, many different denominations and groups, most pastors are trained to learn theology and, secondly, how to manage an American church. That will not cut it in this decline that we're in. We have to learn how to be missionaries. And, we've started a way to do that through some technology and in churches, but it's just something that we have to do. And somewhere along the line, I'm hoping that the leaders of denominations and movements will get that so that all these people are trained in missiology. My son got it in England, and then he got more of it in Indiana Wesleyan. And now he's a new pastor at this church that we go to. And people say, oh, you're here so because your son's a pastor. I made it very clear to him, I'm not there because my son's a pastor. Something way more important in my life is the fact that because he's had the training he's had, these people have no idea the kind of outreach and mission they're going to be doing. But it's been a kind of a declining church, like a lot of churches. I know it's an older church, but he's already got them committed to starting a second, more contemporary worship service in a coffee shop in town. And they're kind of all excited about it. Now, whether they'll fire him in the next couple of months or not, I have no idea. So far, so good, but you never know. But I know how losers are. But they're LCMC, so there's a great chance that he can make it. So, it's a challenge that we have. And the significant decline of churches and the secularization of our society kind of lies at our feet. But it's not too late. It's not too late. It's a perfect time. I don't know if you could thank God for the pandemic, if that's even theologically appropriate, but God has got our attention, and I can thank God for that, and you can too, and you should. But you should also say, we got to either fish or cut bait. We got to move on this. We've got to be fishers of men and women. And so, this reality drives some further tangible recommendations for your post-COVID window of opportunity. And when Tracy comes up a little later, she's going to give you those. We'll be praying for you.
Okay, we're going to take a short break here now we've got about 15 minutes. If you're not familiar with the building, when you exit here, on either side are restrooms. Also, you will find that there are some refreshments for you out in the lobby. We have coffee and Krispy Kreme donuts. The large orange cooler thing has iced tea in it, and there is also water available for you. Books and resources are available for you to look at and purchase on the table out by where you registered when you came in. And if we could gather back then in 15 minutes, so at 10:35, please, 10:40, start making your way back in. We're running just a little bit off schedule, but that's okay. This is important stuff to talk about. Then we'll hear from Tracy, and then we'll have an opportunity to engage in some discussion and ask some questions. So, you're on break.
been at churches where
Okay, can everybody hear me as you come in? Good? Excellent. I can yell, yeah. I could yell at Jason, but I don't think it would help. Exactly. Could be a tidge louder maybe, just a little bit. Everybody good? Everybody get their coffee and their Krispy Kreme? I have a couple confessions to make. I haven't had donuts since January because I've been off sugar. I had a non-COVID, just so you all know, a non-COVID health-related issue earlier this year, so I had to watch my diet a little bit. So today was the first, don't tell my husband this, and I know he's not watching the live stream, so I had a donut today. It was my first Krispy Kreme since like January 1st. Yeah, thank you. Now, my second confession is actually, it has to do maybe with somebody in this room, I don't know. The last LCMC event that I spoke at was in Iowa, and we were on the main stage, and I had a little bit too much coffee that morning, and when I got done with my presentation, I really had to go to the ladies' room. So after I was done speaking, I went right off stage and immediately went into the ladies' room. It was just right down the hall, and there was a woman who followed me into the ladies' room and was in the stall next to me and said, Tracy, I know that's you. I really have to ask you a question. So here we are going to the bathroom, and she's asking her question. And I was able to, I was able to finish up a little bit sooner than she was, and because I wanted to get back out. I do not know who that woman was, but if you're here, maybe come up to me later and just introduce yourself. So, the good news for all of you today, at least for you ladies, is that Kent and I will be here for a dedicated Q&A session later, so you don't have to follow me into the ladies' room when I'm done, okay? Just so we're clear on that. Just a couple things. You have in your folders there that participant guide. In the back of that guide, there's going to be a number of resources that I'm going to mention as we go forward here over the next few minutes. You don't have to try to keep track of those resources. They're all listed for you there. Some of those things are from Church Doctor Ministries. Some of them are websites from other ministries and other resources, things to look at. So that's at the very back of your participant guide. There's also in that folder a couple things. There's this registration card. If there's something that we talk about today, or maybe you have a prayer request or a special interest in ministry you'd like to follow up with, either Kent or I, if you would be so kind as to fill out this registration card. Again, Kent and I will be here through the afternoon. Good news for you, our flight has been delayed, so we're not going to be rushed to leave. Kind of bad news for us to get home tonight, but good news for you. We'll have more time over lunch and this afternoon for those Q&A type questions. But if you've got anything else that you'd like to know about in ministry, or any questions or anything like that, and maybe we do run out of time, please do take the opportunity to fill out this card. We will get right back to you. We also have prayer requests on the back of this card. We have a team of people that pray. It's an international prayer team. Every Monday morning, they gather by Zoom. We were even doing this before the pandemic, but we gather by Zoom and conference call to pray over prayer requests. So if you've got anything you'd like for our team to pray over, we'll be happy to do that for you as well, and know that it will be prayed for. The other thing that you have, and this was our pandemic project, we now have QR codes, which is really exciting for us, trying to be a cutting-edge ministry. We're going to talk about that. So instead of trying to submit an email or something like that to get some free resources and things like that from Church Doctor, you can just scan this little code. Now, I had to figure out and test it and make sure it would work myself because I wasn't quite sure we could really pull this off. But we did. We had a lot of time in the pandemic to practice. So if you want to get some free resources, just scan that code and you'll be able to get some other free resources from Church Doctor Ministries. So with that, I'd like everybody just to take a deep breath and then just kind of gently let it out. Yeah, just take a pause. Doesn't that feel good? One, to be able to take a deep breath without a mask on, and to be able to sit close to people and not feel like you're, breaking a rule or a mandate, and just taking a pause to be with your fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, right? Just to be next to one another. Now I'd like for you to look at the person to the right or left of you or around you and just say, Thanks for everything. And everything's going to be all right. And just say, and everything's going to be all right. Isn't that fun to be able to say that too? Because everything is going to be all right. We made it, right? We got through some really challenging times as pastors and ministry leaders and church staffs and worship teams. A year ago, we know, not very many people were saying that. Not many people were saying, thanks for everything, and everything's going to be all right, to very many people. The world and work of the church and our ministry pretty much changed overnight, right? Where I live in Ohio, it was like there was just a flip of a switch, and overnight, churches had to figure out how to do things that they had never done before. Worship, Bible studies, how does a pastor go and visit someone in a hospital or nursing home. All of that changed overnight, and it's had a huge impact on a key area that I'm going to talk about first, and then we'll talk about some other strategies and resources. But this whole idea of how we share, communicate our messages, what are our communication strategies now that we're coming out of this time of the pandemic where we were forced into changing our messaging and our communication and all the things that we did with our church members. We were forced overnight, and we're tired now. We're feeling a little bit weary. It's kind of like the title here. We're talking about this kind of COVID weariness that we all have. And a lot of that has come from we've had to change how we communicate with people. But it's also brought a tremendous opportunity for our churches and how they communicate and share their message, because we have more people looking. We have more people watching. We have more opportunities to engage and to share what we do in mission and ministry and to share that hope that Kent talked about. So how do we do that effectively? Now, coming out of COVID, a lot of churches had to scramble and patch things together. People who would say, oh, we're never going to do online worship, or we're never going to, switch our newsletter to an email. Well, email just doesn't work. I mean, I think we all discovered all things that we said weren't going to work before and how they had to work for us now. So what are some of the key things strategically to think about going forward as you think about communicating and sharing who you are and what you do as a church? So I'm going to give you some key strategies and some things to think about, and then we'll get into some of these resources here in a moment. So thinking about your key communication strategies. We have internal communication strategies, and these are the things that are the specific communications that you use every day throughout your church to communicate with people who are already there. So these internal communication strategies. Sometimes we've been known in the church to use what we call the shotgun approach, where we just start blasting stuff out. We're going to put it in the newsletter, we're going to have announcements, we're going to put it in the bulletin, pastor's going to make announcements, those kind of things. We kind of use this shotgun blast. We take the same message and try to just get it out to as many of our members as possible. There are some those traditional ways that we have done that. Again, the bulletins, the internal newsletters, mailings, that kind of stuff. Now with COVID, I'd like to challenge you to think about some of these pioneering strategies, and many of you are probably already doing these, but think about some pioneering strategies around using more video, using social media, doing some very dedicated, segmented chats and messages, text groups, doing some things using some relational storytelling to get the messages out about your church. And the reason for this is that we live in a world that is just where people are being bombarded by information, right? So we need to find those channels and those mechanisms. The things that we used to do, even internally, may not work anymore. We need to move to some of these newer strategies. We need to look at things like social media and our websites and having some really dedicated clear messages internally for our own people, because now they're really used to being around screens, and there may even be some screen fatigue. So what else can we do to overcome that? Maybe it's moving away from a screen into a chat group or something like that, where you can send out dedicated messages to a group of people, maybe your small groups in your church, those kind of things. So think about what that communication looks like internally. And then externally, so what are those things that you're doing to share your church's message outside in the surrounding community? And this needs to be a pretty focused approach as well. And some of the things that we've done traditionally, we've used the same newsletter. So the same newsletter that we would use internally, well, we would send that out to, a new person or a visitor or a guest, and maybe that would be the thing that would represent our church. Or we would have welcome packets that would be overstuffed with a lot of information because, again, that shotgun blast. We wanted to get everything there was to know about our church into that welcome packet and to share that with people. And those were kind of some of the traditional things that, people aren't really even, as you saw through COVID, using paper anymore, right? Even when some of you maybe as you've opened back up, you don't do paper bulletins, or people won't even take paper bulletins, or because they're just not quite sure yet. There's still a lot of that COVID weariness and some of that fatigue around what's healthy and what's safe for people. And then that may not be the case for people who are already in your church, but think externally. What are some of the fears that the world still has about coming into a place like a church? And how can you help lessen and communicate this is a safe place, this is a healthy place, this is a place where we can get you some good information about who we are and what we do, but we're not going to overload you with stuff that maybe you're not ready for yet. So think about having some specific and dedicated systems to share the God stories of your church. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But how are you sharing the stories of how God is moving, working, and blessing in your lives with those people who are your visitors and guests? And then the other strategy is think about communication and messaging from an outreach perspective. An outreach perspective of how you're going to reach the people. Remember what I started with, more people are watching, right? We hear story after story from pastors and ministry leaders who are sharing with us how they can see by the numbers online that more people are watching live stream services, they're watching on YouTube, they're joining in from Zoom calls. In fact, we just had a pastor share with us that he leads a Bible study every Wednesday night. It started off with about 60 to 70 people. Now there are 200 people, and they're from all over the United States. So we live now in this tremendous outreach opportunity to communicate and share our message. But how do we effectively do that so that we can engage and build then personal relationships with people? So think about how you're doing that with your outreach. So traditionally, it would be you all come, right? You come to our church. Here's an invitation. Here's when we worship. Show up at Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, and you will find the friendliest church in town, because St. Paul's Lutheran Church, insert city and state, is the friendliest church in town. We always hear that, whether you are or not. And I can tell you I've been in some of those churches who say they're the friendliest church in town, but they're not really. Nothing against any St. Paul's or anything like that if you have a St. Paul's here. But think about how you are communicating, who you are and what you do. So in today's time of this post-COVID, think about everyone as a missionary. Everyone should be equipped and sent to share the story of your church and their own personal story about how God and being connected to God through your church has made a difference in their life. Because of that receptivity now of people who are hopeless, if they know you're a Christian, they may come and ask you things like, my cousin died from COVID. Is there really a heaven? Where do you think my cousin went? Because we weren't brought up in the church. And do you have people in your church who are prepared in their personal relationships to answer those types of questions, to have a message for those people who are going to be asking some really challenging questions now. So think about communication as an outreach mechanism where you are training and equipping the people in your church to share these really important messages and to think about how to answer some of these tough questions. Maybe you even get a small group going to think and to talk about and think through what are some of the questions that an unchurched person who has just gone through COVID, maybe lost someone, maybe went through that sickness themselves, what are some of the questions they may ask, you know? Or better yet, if you have the gift of this type of communication, sit down with an unchurched friend and just ask them how they're doing and see what they say and have that conversation. That's a really important type of outreach communication that we should be thinking about in our churches today. Remember I said, again, I'm going to keep driving this point home, more people are looking and watching. So now I'm going to share 3 strategies of effective church communication. They're the 3 C's of effective church communication. And many of you may already know this and do this, but think about it now, thinking about it to reach unchurched people or people who may be looking at your church who've never looked at your church before. Maybe they found you online. Maybe now they're checking out your website. Maybe you've got some videos that are up. So think about what else they're going to see beyond that. So make sure that your communication is current. So if you do have websites, blogs, discussion boards, Facebook pages and groups, those Twitter feeds, stuff like that, pay attention to dates, times, details. Make sure that things on there are regularly updated and refreshed. Make sure that the images that you're using are pictures of smiley, happy people. Don't focus in on your building and pews and stained glass, but focus in on smiley, happy people. If you're familiar with the book Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller, that's a basic marketing and communication. When you're trying to build a relationship with people, use images that they can connect with, and people connect with other people. They're not going to connect with a building. Even if it's a beautiful building and a space and a worship space that looks like this, that's great for us, right? We can walk in and appreciate the cross and the lighting and the screens and the comfortable chairs, especially if we grew up in the Lutheran church that I did that had the wood pews that creaked, and every time you moved in it, you got knocked on the back of the head by grandma who was sitting behind you. It's a true story. Every time I moved and the seat would creak, and yeah, I wasn't smart enough to figure out that I should just point to my brother and say he did it, but although he was pointing to me, so maybe that was the issue. But, think about this. Don't use your building as the focal point. Even if it's a great brand new facility, use smiley, happy people to communicate in your church. Images that are appropriate, that people can really feel that they can belong and be a part of that. Materials should be fresh and clean. Don't use things that are dated or worn. If you're still using clip art from, the 1990s and stuff like that. I knew I'd get a laugh from Jason on that one. But if you're still, think about the images and the materials and those kind of things. Now is a perfect time just to look at all of the stuff that you're using and saying, is this really clearly communicating who we are and what we do as a church? And then be consistent. You can call this branding or marketing, call it, putting themes together and design. What you call it doesn't matter, but be consistent. And what I mean by that is create consistent language to describe who you are and what you do, because language shapes culture. And language can send intentional and unintentional messages to people. So remember, thinking that a bunch of new people in the world have found your church, maybe through online or Facebook or their friend who shared that worship live stream link or whatever. So be thinking about the language that you use as well, and the vocabulary. What I mean by that is don't use internal language that only we understand. Don't talk about how you're the friendliest church in town because we have the greatest coffee in the narthex every Sunday morning at 11 o'clock, right? Because nobody's going to know what the narthex is. They're going to think that's some new trendy coffee shop in Omaha. right? And they're going to say, what are the directions to the narthex? What's that address? So think about, or if you say things about that are very specific to your church, you could isolate people because they don't understand. And so you're sending those unintentional, not very welcoming messages, even when you think you're trying to explain a ministry or a mission that you're really passionate about and does really great work. The language and the vocabulary that you use can actually send an unintentional negative message that that's something that maybe they can't be a part of. So just be really careful about the language that you use and be consistent. Find themes and phrases and words. And also understand, too, that when I talk about things like marketing, I'm not talking about us that we're trying to sell Jesus to people, right? Because Jesus sells himself, right? I mean, really, once people hear that message. So it's not about trying to be pushy and to use, weird sales and marketing tactics because we're trying to sell something to people. We're trying to share a really important story and to share a really important message that people need to hear right now. So whatever you call it, that's fine, but be consistent with what you're doing. And then be clear. Have what we call clear calls to action. What do you want people to do? Do you want people to, maybe if they're on your website, schedule a visit, or talk to a pastor, or talk to a member, and you have an option and you can use technology to do this. You can chat with a member live right on the main page of your website. But be really clear in what you want people to do. Stop by and visit us. Or connect with one of our, hospitality family members, or whatever it is that you want them to do. Don't just assume that when they land on your website or if they landed on your live stream, they're going to know what to do, because they're not going to know that next step. They're going to hear probably a really good message, and they're going to be engaged in that, but make sure that you're clear on what you want them to do. If you have a digital ministry or you're thinking about a digital ministry, we're going to talk about this here in a few moments, but have someone who is intentionally assigned to engage with people online. If you've got a chat function or a discussion board or something like that, make sure that you have someone who is putting clear calls to action. Let's schedule, there's time where we do, coffee at this, particular place or whatever, and do some invitation and challenge back and forth. People may or may not take you up on that, but at least, they'll feel that they understand that there's some personal next step that they can take, rather than the shotgun blast of them just watching a screen. So be really clear with your calls to action. And keep this in mind. Your websites, your social media, your online worship, they are all now your new front doors, right? You're not going to have people who just make that leap from being an unchurched person and show up at you. You might have, because God can do anything. I shouldn't say it that way. But it's highly likely that you are going to have more people who get connected to your church because of your website, your social media, Facebook, Twitter. You send out a link, if you're doing live streams or recorded live streams, and then you send that out to members. You should be asking your members to forward that live stream, that link on, that recorded link, if you're not doing that now. So, if you have an email where you send out a recorded worship, make sure you have a call to action to forward this on to a friend and see, if there's someone that may get connected even that way. So just think about all those things that you do are things that can connect people to your church. Those communication strategies, the messages that you're getting out. We're working with a lot of churches. In fact, that's from the very beginning of the pandemic, that's one of the things that, there are two things that we were getting the most phone calls about right now. The very beginning of the pandemic, it was, how do we do a live stream? Or my favorite one is, what is Facebook and how do we get on there tomorrow? From a pastor. I'm not kidding. It was like, what is Facebook and how do we get on there tomorrow? Because we can't worship. I'm like, okay, well, let's just get this started, right? We'll get you on, we'll work on getting on Facebook. The second one, towards the end of the pandemic, and this is kind of a sad one, we have more and more churches calling us because their pastors are burnt out from trying to figure out all of this stuff with the technology, because we have older pastors who were just never prepared for this. And so now we're getting, as the pandemic went on, we have more people who are calling us saying, our pastor needs some help. Either we need to get a transition, or we need to figure out how to do an ongoing digital ministry, and where do we find someone that does that for our church, and those kind of things. So switching gears to the 10 tangible approaches and resources. Again, remember, these are listed in the back of your book, and some of these things are from Church Doctor Ministries, and some of these things you can do on your own or as a combination. Kent mentioned civility before, so number one, start Bible studies on what God says about civility. We do have the Restoring Civility book with us today. If you also want to order more copies of that, we offer discounts to LCMC churches because we're a preferred provider. So if we don't have enough copies for you today, just let me know, and we can get you enough copies to start Bible studies. But our country is being torn apart from incivility and just the lack of respect for one another. And we really, as Christians, the church can bring civility to our communities again. We have the message of how to treat people all throughout Scripture. There are lessons and lessons and lessons from Jesus on how to treat one another. And so spend some time studying about how we can restore civility back into our country again. There's just so much that the church can do and be a part of to bring a positive message, and that message of hope, into some really heated and challenging conversations. But for the most part, from what we've seen, the church has not been able to navigate those challenging situations from a biblical perspective. Unfortunately, they fall into more of the political and social justice perspective. We need to keep the focus on that Christian scripture perspective. Number two, re-engineer your leadership influence from programs to movement mentality. Think movement, as Kent said earlier. Think movement. Focus on equipping people in your church with this idea of we are part of a Christian movement, all of us together. It's not just a program with a beginning date and an end date, but focus on doing things where you are discipling others in ministry constantly, never doing ministry alone, thinking movement and multiplication. Who can you invest in now and to multiply who you are and what you do? And everyone can do this. You're never too old to disciple someone else, and there's never anyone who's too old to be discipled into something in ministry. So think about how you can equip people, especially now, because people have, some time on their hands. Depending on what's happened with their work and their family situations, you may find some people who are in a new place in life where they can actually spend a little more time working on this idea of turning your church into a movement instead of just one program after another. Number three, think New Testament multiplication. Teach those who are ready now about how to disciple others. And there's a lot of this. I know many of you have read Who Broke My Church? The steps to discipleship there that we recommend are in that book. But it's really simple. It's invitation and challenge. It's what Jesus did when he said, "Come follow me." He modeled for the disciples what he wanted them to do. He taught as he did ministry, and then he debriefed with them and explained, why things worked and why things didn't work. It's really simple. We make it way more complicated than what it needs to be in the church, but it's really simple. Inviting someone to just follow you in ministry, investing in them, speaking with them about what you do, how you do it. And it's not rocket science, but we do make it a challenge. Number four, budget your leadership. Focus on early adopters. Train them to influence those who are the middle adopters, and then know that in any new thing that you try to do, you're always going to have the late and never adopters. Still do ministry with those folks, still minister to them, still be their pastor. Don't give up on them, the late and never adopters, but focus on the early adopters, especially right now, because in the church, we have a lot of people who are really on fire for reaching people in mission and ministry because they've seen the opportunity that's there, because they are getting questions from people about, even things like this. Why did God cause COVID? Right? I'm sure that each of you know people in your church, or maybe you've even had this conversation with somebody yourself, an unchurched person. They know you're a Christian or know you're a pastor, and they say, Pastor, why did God cause COVID? Well, think about how you're going to respond to that. And we have these early adopters who are just kind of naturally going to be in some of these conversations or have an interest because they've seen where in so many places in our communities, our government, our political systems, where we've just failed. But the church has a role in making a difference in some of these areas where we've learned from COVID a lot about some things in our healthcare system, some things in our political systems, some things in our community delivery systems, where we see huge gaps. And the church and Christians maybe can fill in some of those gaps. And so there are already people in your church who have probably had some type of experience through COVID where God is already using them or at work on them to do something new in mission and ministry. So focus in on finding those early adopters and equipping and sending them. Number 5, consider using the resource Who Broke My Church to nurture that mission thinking among those who are ready now. Again, we've got that book and that study guide there, but there's just a lot of, I was just telling someone over the break, that book came out a year and a half, 2 years probably, before COVID. But I actually was going back through it the other day and thinking about the strategies that are in there and the research and some of the things that are written about in mission and ministry, and they're actually more applicable now than they were 3 years ago because of where we're at in our world today. So if you have an opportunity to read through that book, again, look at those folks who are eager to reach unchurched people, and then think about how to nurture that mission, movement, multiplication idea. Number 6, sponsor a Discover Your Spiritual Gifts workshop. The thing about spiritual gifts, and this ties into early adopters and the opportunity that we have, because so many things have changed in our world today, we know that every renewal movement that we've seen, including the Protestant Reformation, has 2 core biblical teachings. One is the priesthood of all believers, which should sound familiar to all of us, right? And the second one is the discovery and the use and engagement of people in their spiritual gifts in that movement, in that Reformation. And this is really important because, again, we have people right now in our churches who have probably been changed and transformed or challenged, or maybe they're feeling like, we just went through this horrible thing. I wonder if there's just not more to life for me than just, going to church at 10 o'clock on Sunday and getting the best table at Bob Evans and then hitting the golf course or watching football and just going about my week Monday through Friday and starting all over again on Sunday and going to church and same old, right? Because all of those routines were broken. They couldn't go to church on Sunday to be with all their friends. They couldn't go to Bob Evans and try to beat somebody to the best table. They couldn't get out to the golf course or to the Buffalo Wild Wings and watch the football game or anything like that, right? So their entire lives were turned upside down. And now they're asking themselves some questions. God, what am I supposed to do with my life? And I've talked to these people already over the last year. People who are making major career moves. People who are making actually changes into how they live their life and their lifestyle. And because they see what's happened in our world through this pandemic. They see things differently now. So help people understand their spiritual gifts. And as they understand their spiritual gifts, then they can understand how God has uniquely called and equipped them to serve in the kingdom. And if we don't ever help people discover their spiritual gifts, we're missing a huge opportunity, especially right now, as people are rethinking who they are, what they do, maybe what God has called them to do. So help people discover their spiritual gifts. Number 7, expand and further develop your online or digital ministry. And I'm sure you've heard this before, maybe you've read this online if you've been researching online ministries and those kind of things, but don't stop what you're doing. Build on it. I know that we all love that we're, quote, back to normal because we're in person, right? Don't set aside what you have been doing on your digital and online ministry efforts. Don't give up on that. Why? Because I've said it before. What? People are watching. Oh, come on, guys, say it with me. People are watching, right? More than just the people at your church are finding your church online. So don't stop what you're doing. Build on it. Think about, evaluate things, assess how it's going, see what's working well, see what isn't, what kind of things do you need to do with your technology. Maybe there's some equipment changes and systems type things that you need to do, but just do that quick assessment, what's working well, what isn't. Add a digital ministry team. This is a great way to get young people involved. So right now, you may even have some families, some new families that have gotten connected to your church, and maybe they have some young people, some teens, maybe even younger than that, who are also maybe now watching church with mom and dad online. Have somebody type in a couple times throughout your worship services, hey, we're looking for some people to help us keep our online ministry going, or we're looking for some people to help us do our Facebook Live, or those kind of things. And just put a gentle call to action, a gentle invitation and challenge out there as you're online, and just ask if anybody would be interested in helping to do the online ministry that they're seeing, because they may not know that means, okay, we'll probably have to come to church and sit in the sound booth and help those guys and do stuff, but just put that out there and see, because you can actually reach a whole new group of people who have connected to your church on this platform, this new technology. And it could be actually an effective outreach for you to engage with young people, because young people know how to do this stuff. I mean, we're not all spring chickens at Church Doctor, and it took us a month to figure out how to do this. But there's probably some 8th grader out there who could have done it for us in a few hours, right? Because young people know how to do all of these things online. So think about that as a way to get young people involved in your church. Add a digital or an online pastor. And I have the word pastor on there, not to say that it has to be a trained, you don't need someone with a demon to be your digital or online pastor, but it's more of a title. Kind of think about this as a role in your church for a specific ministry. But think about adding a digital or online pastor who can be someone who engages with people intentionally, someone who knows the technology, someone who knows maybe how to do intuitively, some of the things about, putting things in the chat or sending up an emoji here or there, or doing, just that encouragement, somebody who knows about how those digital platforms work. And so, maybe you can call them, as your digital or online pastor, and then train them into other areas of mission and ministry. It could be a great entry point for someone in your church to get some really foundational engagement with people online, but then also they could grow into that role. But it's just a really important thing to think about, that maybe, and it doesn't have to be a full-time person, it could be someone who's part-time or a third of the time or just a few hours on a Sunday morning. It doesn't have to be a huge investment, but someone who has that dedicated role in your church to be kind of that online voice for you. Number 8, review your ministry staff structure and infrastructure. Pastors and staff are tired now, so just check in with them. So if you're a member here, maybe a support staff member, or a pastor who has a team of pastors with you in your church. I know many of you are probably already pastors, but just check in with each other, check in with your staff. Just see how things are going. Do we need to take a day where it's a spiritual day where we just all set aside and just do what I did with you guys at the beginning and say, let's just take a pause and take a breath now. And I know everybody wants to get really excited about ramping up because now we're all back and we're going into summer, and so now we're going to have the challenges of summer travel, and how do we keep numbers going now as we open it? But let's just take a moment with your staff teams, whether paid or unpaid, and just check in with them and ask them how they're doing. And ask this question: how can I pray for you? And then, if you are that pastor, don't be too humble or shy or afraid to share what's going on. Be honest, be transparent. One of the best things that you can do as a leader is to show, especially right now, that there are a few things that I'm tired and frustrated and it's okay to share those kind of things within the safety of your staff team and just have those really important conversations. Many pastors right now are retiring or stepping back from full-time ministry. This was a challenge before the pandemic, where we had a shortage of pastors and we had more pastors that were retiring than we were training. And this isn't a Lutheran thing. It's an across-the-board mainline denomination and independent. And anywhere you look, seminaries are in a shortage of pastors and rethinking their model. All of that was happening before the pandemic. So the pandemic, there's two things that's really interesting that's happening. One, pastors are retiring or rethinking their own personal and professional calls to ministry, full-time ministry as a pastor. And two, other people are having a wake-up call now about what to do with their lives and thinking, I'm, at a certain age, maybe it's time for me to retire. Maybe I got my job, significantly changed because of COVID. Maybe there's something I could do in ministry or for the church or with the church. And so we have the two kind of unique things happening. Pastors are thinking about leaving the ministry because they've been through so much over the last year. And we have people who are not pastors who are thinking about what could I do? Maybe God has a different plan for me right now. I lost my job, things aren't ever going to be the same with my work, or I'm just going to retire because I'm not going to go back to work. I worked from home for the last year, and I don't want to go back to that cubicle. Maybe there's something else that I can do, and maybe it's in ministry. So there's a unique ministry staffing opportunity that is ahead, but you'll need to plan for it. So check in with your pastor, check in with your staff, take a look at how things are going with your staff and your infrastructure, and then look around and see if you have any of these folks who are in your church who are making these kind of decisions right now about their own professional careers. Because they're out there, I know they are. I've talked to them already, people who are making these changes. Number 9, take time to assess where your entire church is at. Again, it's kind of like taking that pause where I started today. Get some help. It doesn't have to be us, doesn't have to be church doctor, but just get some help to take the temperature of your church and ask these questions. How's it going? Where is God moving now? What is God saying to us? And what are we going to do about it? And how has God gifted and called us to serve in this great time of potential to reach lost people? Because it's very different today than it was a year and a half ago. I guarantee you that the answers to those questions are very different because God is revealing some really interesting opportunities for us through what's happened with COVID. So just take some time, even if all you do as far as your assessment is just to read through those questions, either as a leadership team, a staff team, your councils, have your small groups do that and report back. Take a half-day retreat or a few moments after worship just to do a quick assessment on yourselves. How's it going? What's God doing here? And how have we been, as a church, uniquely called and gifted to serve in this time of potential? And then finally, number 10, we have some new resources coming out in 2021 and 2022, but there are things that you could get started on now if you're interested. So we're going to share just a couple things that we're working with some churches and some early steps here. Starting a God Stories movement, we'll have a resource book that's called The Amazing Power of God Stories. We saw the scripture about Jesus teaching the parables. I thought that was that was a God thing, really, that's where Mario started us off today, talking about stories, because this is a really important time for us to share our God stories right now. And we've got some resources ahead of the book that we can help you with. If you want to know more about how to start a God Stories movement in your church, where you're sharing more about where God is moving in your lives, we can help you with that. And then we also have to increase Bible study in churches. One of the things that our statistics have shown us is that there's a relatively low level of Bible study in churches today. And this was actually even before the pandemic. Even among Lutheran churches, which is really interesting when you think about our heritage and our Lutheran background, because Martin Luther had put so much into reading Scripture, right? Scripture alone. And yet, we see many Lutheran churches with a low level of Bible reading. And so we have a new devotional book that's coming out towards the end of 2021 and into 2022, but we're also tying that to a Bible reading challenge. So the devotional book is an apple a day from the Church Doctors, a daily dose of everyday faith. And then there's a Bible reading challenge that goes with that to help increase the Scripture reading in our churches. So these are just a few as I close out here. Post-COVID strategies that can help your church. And I'd like to leave you with these three things to focus in on. How can we reconnect, renew, and reach out? And this came from a survey, actually, that we did at Church Doctor Ministries about mid-pandemic-wise, when we realized that things were going to start to open back up at some point. We did a survey. It was a digital survey, and just sent it out to a number of the churches that we work with, and just said, hey, what are the top things that you are the most concerned about right now? And these were the three things. How do we reconnect with the people who have drifted away? Because we're really concerned that with the online services that we've done, it's really easy for people to stay on their couch, and then now they're going to be drifting out from the couch to the golf course and the pool and the vacation and all of that. So how do we reconnect with people? So be thinking about that, those people who have drifted. So think about these strategies. How can we reconnect using these strategies with the people who have drifted away? How do we renew our spiritual formation and discipleship practices as a church? Because so much of that changed and maybe was stopped completely. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was a lot of things like, well, what do we do about Bible studies, in-person Bible studies? What do we do about communion? What do we do about, all of these things that are really important grounding spiritual formation practices? How do we renew those now? Still thinking about there are going to be people who are going to be concerned about health and safety, and what does that look like now? Do we have large groups that are together, and do we do things in homes, or what does it look like, when we're together at church? What does communion look like? A lot of churches figured out how to do communion, a different way. With the cups and the little wafer on top, and you kind of peel. You guys know what I'm talking about, and you peel the little wafer off and have that instead of having the bread and the community chalice there and everything. So do you go back? Do you offer both? What are the things that you do with those important spiritual formation practices? And then our discipleship practices. Where are the opportunities where we can renew those really important discipleship practices about talking about we're all missionaries on a mission? And what does that look like in our church? And then reaching out to our community and our neighbors, the people who started following you on social media. Remember, people are watching. So how are you reaching out to those people? How are you connecting with those folks to build now personal relationships? Because that's the challenge. You want to find those ways that in your culture and context and community, church community, you're moving them from the screen to that personal relationship, and so that they can become connected in person with your church. And that's going to look very differently for each of you, and the timeline for that is going to look very different for each of you in your church. So how can we reconnect, renew, and reach out? Because COVID changed a lot. It brought a lot of loss, it brought a lot of grief, it brought a lot of stress. But here's what we know. We know that God uses all things for good. God brings the hope, God brings His grace, and God brings that forgiveness and that calling into mission and ministry, and He's given us these gifts that every single one of us have to be a missionary on His mission. So we're feeling a bit COVID weary. I hope that after today, you'll feel really just God energized and hope filled by the opportunity and the potential that every single one of you have to reach lost people, because God is the God of hope. We have that hope, and that hope is meant to be shared more than anything else, all of the negative things that we've experienced. We still have hope, and so let's go about sharing that hope with others. Thank you very much.
Wow. So I don't know about you, but my mind is racing. And so we have dedicated this portion of time before we break for lunch to just do some talking about this. Maybe you have questions for either Kent or Tracy about some of the things that they've talked about. Maybe you have some thoughts or ideas that you would like to share. And so I'd kind of like to open it up to all of you now to just ask questions or share some of your thoughts that you have after listening to both of these outstanding people share kind of a vision and a focus with us as we enter into post-COVID-19. Anybody? Bob? Pardon me? Where is Dr. Hunter? Well, he stepped out. Okay, so you have to wait. He'll be right back. I'm not going to say that out loud in the microphone where he is. My mama didn't raise me that way. I have a question for you, Tracy. One of the things I noticed, one of the terms that I noticed that you were using in your presentation was this term about early adopters, middle adopters. Can you clarify for us what that is?
Sure. So early adopters would be those people who, if you're a pastor or ministry leader and you have a new idea, right, and you know already kind of who these people are, who are the first people or group of people that you take that idea to? The people that you know are going to get really excited about reaching unchurched people, mission and ministry, anything that is going to help the church reach more people and new people, the folks that get really excited about those new things. In the book, Who Broke My Church, we use the phrase holy discontent. Those are the people people with holy discontent are not negative people. They're the people who are actually really excited about their church. They want to see their church reach more people. They want to see their church be more impactful in their community. Those are the people that would be the early adopters. So those people who have that holy discontent, they're not the negative Nellies of the church or anything like that. They tend to be more positive. They're supportive. Now, they're not like, blue sky and sunshine over the top, yeah, let's just go do everything, because you want to, you want to temper that excitement a little bit with some good strategy and leadership, but mobilizing those people together to become a core group of people who then could implement some of these new ideas, these new things that you may be thinking about. So those are the early adopters, those people who really have what we would call a high percentage of holy discontent. And then you'll have those middle adopters, because the thing about the middle adopters, they'll actually be the larger group. And there's nothing wrong about being in the middle there, because they're the folks who, as they see the early adopters, so like their friends or family members who are in the church, they see them going forward first, they are more likely to follow, because they're going to say, well, what's your name? George? If George is doing it, it must be okay. And they'll go, well, or maybe not. Maybe George is not that person. But those are the kind of people who, those middle adopters, they want to see who's going ahead first, who's taking that first step and that first challenge. And then those folks will usually come along. Yeah, good question.
Thank you. Okay, so Bob, you want to share your question for Kent?
Yes. So, I hope you can hear me.
Can I pick this up and take it down?
Okay.
Here, I'll bring you a mic.
All right, Dr. Hunter, in your presentation for the church membership, okay, now I'm going to sit down now.